The late afternoon sun poured its golden rays into my small, cluttered living room. Toys were scattered across the floor. An untouched bottle sat on the coffee table, and a worn-out baby monitor blinked in silence. My heart raced as I sat on the couch, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. The message on the screen blurred as my eyes filled with tears, disbelief washing over me. "They want to sell her," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. Felt like the walls were closing in on me. The room, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. It had started innocently enough, one small mistake that spiraled out of control. When my husband, Derek, passed away last year in a car accident, I was left to pick up the pieces. At the time, I was 3 months pregnant with our daughter, Lily. He had been my rock, my partner in everything, and his sudden absence left a gaping hole in my life. Bills piled up, and the insurance payout barely covered the essentials. I made do with what I could, but being a single mother wasn't just hard, it was isolating. I had turned to a local parenting support group, desperate for connection. The group met weekly at the community center, and while most of the parents were kind, there was one couple who stood out: the Webbers. Allison and Greg Webber were polished, affluent, and unervingly charming. They always seemed to have the answers to every problem, offering unsolicited advice and subtly judging anyone who didn't measure up to their pristine standard of parenting. At first, I welcomed their attention. Allison had a way of making me feel seen during a time when I felt invisible. She would compliment Lily's soft curls, offer to babysit so I could have a break, and bring over expensive baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. I thought she was a godsend, but things started to feel off. Allison's questions about Lily grew more personal, almost invasive. "Does she have any family on your husband's side?" she asked one day, her tone casual but her eyes calculating. "It must be so hard doing this all on your own." I brushed it off as concern, but Greg's behavior was harder to ignore. He had an unsettling habit of picking Lily up without asking, cradling her as if she were his own. Once, I caught him whispering to her, his words too quiet for me to hear. When I asked what he was saying, he only smiled and handed her back to me without answering. Then came the offer. It was late one evening when Allison showed up unannounced. She had a bottle of wine in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. Her smile was wide, but her eyes darted around nervously. "I have a proposition for you," she said, sitting down at my kitchen table. I listened in stunned silence as she laid out her plan. She and Greg wanted to adopt Lily. Not permanently, she insisted, but just long enough for me to get back on my feet. They'd take care of all her needs, provide her with opportunities one could never afford, and give her a life of luxury. And of course, Allison added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "we'd make sure you're well compensated for your sacrifice." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "She's not for sale," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. Allison's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, come on, dear. Don't think of it that way. This is about what's best for Lily. Surely, you want her to have the best life possible." I didn't sleep that night. Their offer replayed in my mind like a broken record, and as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't help but consider their words. My savings were dwindling, my landlord had started hinting at raising the rent, and I could barely afford formula, let alone daycare. But every time I thought of handing Lily over to them, even temporarily, my chest ached with a pain I couldn't describe. I told them no the next day. That should have been the end of it. But the Webbers weren't the type to take no for an answer. The harassment started slowly. Allison would show up at the community center meetings with pitying glances and whispered remarks about my poor decision-making. Greg began calling at odd hours, leaving messages about how I was being selfish by denying Lily a better life. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed to Lily's room. She was there, safe in her crib, but the sight of her sleeping peacefully did little to calm my nerves. I was sure I had locked the door the night before. I changed the locks the same day, but the feeling of safety I once had in my home was gone. The final straw came when I received a text from an unknown number. Attached was a photo of Lily and me at the park, taken just the day before. The message was simple: "You can't protect her forever." My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I didn't know what to do or who to trust. The police wouldn't help without concrete evidence of a threat, and I couldn't afford a lawyer. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let them win. I started taking precautions. I stopped going to the community center meetings and cut off all contact with the Webbers. I installed a security system, even though it meant cutting back on groceries for the month. And I began documenting everything: the calls, the messages, the times I thought I was being followed. Through it all, I kept my focus on Lily. Her laughter was my anchor, her tiny hands gripping mine a reminder of why I couldn't give up. They could try to intimidate me, to wear me down, but I wouldn't let them take her. As I rocked her to sleep that night, I whispered a promise into the darkness: "They'll have to go through me first." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paranoia and determination. Every shadow seemed menacing, every unfamiliar car parked near my building a potential threat. I barely slept, and when I did, it was with one ear open, listening for the faintest noise that might signal danger. The Webbers hadn't contacted me directly since that chilling text, but their presence loomed over every moment of my day. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One evening, as I was walking back from the grocery store, I noticed a black SUV parked at the corner of my street. It had tinted windows, and while it could have belonged to anyone, something about it felt wrong. My grip on the stroller tightened as I pushed Lily home, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my door, I glanced back, only to see the SUV slowly pull away, its engine barely making a sound. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. I reached out to Sarah, my best friend since high school. Sarah and I had drifted apart over the years. She had her own family to care for, and life had a way of pulling us in different directions. But if there was anyone I could trust, it was her. "Sarah, I need your help," I said when she answered my call. My voice cracked under the weight of my fear and exhaustion. "What's going on, Claire?" she asked, her concern evident even through the phone. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's a long story, but there's this couple. They're trying to take Lily from me. I don't know what to do." To her credit, Sarah didn't question me or dismiss my fears. She listened patiently as I explained everything: the Webbers' offer, their harassment, the mysterious text, and the SUV. "Claire, this is serious," she said when I finished. "You need to get the police involved." "I tried," I replied, frustration bubbling up. "They said there's nothing they can do unless there's a clear threat. A text and some weird behavior don't count as evidence." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Then we'll handle this ourselves. Pack a bag for you and Lily and come stay with us for a while. You'll be safer here." The relief I felt was immediate, though it was tinged with guilt. Sarah had 2 young kids of her own, and I hated the idea of burdening her family with my problems. But I didn't have many options left. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," she said firmly. "You're like a sister to me, Claire. We'll figure this out together." The next morning, I packed up as much as I could carry and loaded Lily into the car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't help but glance at the black SUV parked a few houses down. Its engine was off, but I felt the weight of its presence all the same. Sarah's house was a 30-minute drive away, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood far from the chaos of my own life. As I pulled into her driveway, I felt a sense of calm wash over me for the first time in weeks. She met me at the door, pulling me into a tight hug. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. For the first few days, I allowed myself to relax. Sarah and her husband, Mark, were incredibly supportive, taking turns watching Lily so I could catch up on sleep or clear my head. Their home was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the tension that had consumed my own. But the Webbers weren't done with me yet. Started with a phone call. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, hoping it might be one of the job applications I'd sent out. Claire? Allison's voice came through the line, smooth and unbothered, as if she weren't the reason I was living in fear. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. Leave me and my daughter alone. Oh, come now, she replied, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. You're being unreasonable. We're offering you a chance to give Lily a life you can't. Isn't that worth considering? Stay away from us, I said firmly, my voice shaking with anger. Before she could respond, I hung up and blocked the number. But the call left me shaken. No matter how far I ran, it seemed the Webbers would always find me. That night, Sarah and I sat at her kitchen table, brainstorming ways to protect Lily. We need to gather evidence, she said, her brows furrowed in concentration. If we can prove they're stalking you or threatening you, the police will have to take action. It was a solid plan, but putting it into motion was easier said than done. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with the Webbers, from the phone calls to the mysterious SUV sightings. Sarah helped me install a tracking app on my phone to monitor any suspicious activity, and Mark set up security cameras around their property. Despite our efforts, the Webbers seemed to stay one step ahead. One afternoon, as I was walking Lily in the park near Sarah's house, I noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench. Greg Webber. He was reading a newspaper, his posture casual, but his presence sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and run. But before I could move, he looked up and met my gaze. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. "Hello, Claire," he said, folding the newspaper and standing up. "Fancy meeting you here." I gripped the stroller tightly, positioning myself between him and Lily. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Greg chuckled, his hands in his pockets. "Just a friendly chat. You've been making this much harder than it needs to be. Leave us alone," I said, my fear giving way to anger. Now, he said, his tone condescending. "There's no need for hostility. We both know you're in over your head. Let us help you, Claire. It's what's best for everyone." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked away as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of fear and fury. When I got back to Sarah's house, I told her everything. "They're escalating," she said, her expression grim. "We need to involve the authorities again. This has gone too far." She was right. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. The next day, Sarah and I went to the local police station, determined to make them listen. This time we brought everything. The logs, the photos of the SUV, the call records, and the chilling text message. I even mentioned Greg's appearance at the park, describing his veiled threats. The officer at the front desk directed us to Detective Harris, a no-nonsense man in his 40s with a perpetually furrowed brow. He listened intently as I recounted my story, his pen scribbling furiously on a notepad. "You've got quite the situation here," he said when I finished. "But stalking cases can be tricky. Without hard evidence of a direct threat or physical harm, it's difficult to pursue legal action." "But they're following me," I protested, my voice rising. "They've been harassing me for weeks. Isn't that enough?" Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's enough to start an investigation," he said finally. "I'll file a report and see what we can dig up on the Webbers. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. If they contact you again, let me know immediately." It wasn't the definitive action I'd hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. As Sarah and I left the station, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was nearing its end. But the Webbers weren't about to back down so easily. 2 days later, I received an envelope in the mail. It had no return address, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. My stomach churned as I opened it, dread pooling in my chest. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message typed in bold letters. "You can't hide forever." Accompanying the message was a photo of Sarah's house, taken from the street. In the picture, Lily's stroller was visible near the front door. I dropped the paper as if it had burned me. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone to call Sarah. "They know where we are," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. When Sarah saw the photo, her face went pale. "This has gone too far," she said, anger replacing her fear. "We're not waiting for the police to act. We're taking matters into our own hands." Sarah's husband, Mark, was equally furious. That evening, he called a friend who worked as a private investigator, a woman named Rachel who specialized in cases like mine. Rachel agreed to meet with us the next day, and when she arrived, her presence was both reassuring and intimidating. Rachel was sharp and efficient, with a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me at ease. "The first thing we need to do is gather more evidence," she said, pulling out a small notebook. "If they're watching you, we'll watch them. It's time to turn the tables." Over the next week, Rachel worked tirelessly to track the Webbers. She found out where they lived, their place of business, and even the private daycare their children attended. Her investigation uncovered something I hadn't expected. The Webbers weren't just wealthy. They were connected. Greg came from old money, his family's wealth tied to a string of successful businesses. Allison, on the other hand, had a reputation for being manipulative and ruthless. Rachel discovered that they had ties to a questionable adoption agency, one that had been investigated in the past for unethical practices. "It's no coincidence they targeted you," Rachel said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "You're a single mother with limited resources. They probably saw you as an easy mark." Her words stung, but they also steeled my resolve. I wasn't going to let the Webbers win. One evening, as I was putting Lily to bed, Rachel called with an update. "I've got something," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "There's a storage unit registered in Greg Weber's name. It's located just outside of town. I think we should check it out." "What do you think we'll find?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Proof," she replied. "If they're involved in something shady, there's a good chance they're keeping records somewhere. This might be it." The thought of sneaking into a storage unit felt like something out of a crime drama, but Rachel assured me it was perfectly legal, as long as she was the one doing it. "Private investigators operate in a gray area," she explained with a sly smile. The following night, Rachel and Mark drove out to the storage facility while Sarah and I stayed behind to watch the kids. I paced the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if they got caught? What if the Webbers found out what we were doing? When Rachel and Mark returned, their faces were grim. "We found something," Rachel said, placing a folder on the table. Inside were copies of documents, applications, contracts, and payment records, all tied to the adoption agency the Webbers were connected to. One document in particular made my blood run cold. It was an application for Lily. "They've been planning this for months," Rachel said. "They've already started the process to adopt her without your consent." My hands shook as I flipped through the papers. The Webbers had listed false information, claiming I was an unfit mother who had willingly relinquished her parental rights. They even had a forged signature that was supposed to be mine. "This is fraud," Sarah said, her voice filled with outrage. "It's more than that," Rachel added. "It's a criminal conspiracy. With this evidence, the police will have no choice but to act." The next morning, we brought everything to Detective Harris. When he saw the documents, his expression hardened. "This changes everything," he said. I'll issue a warrant for their arrest and contact the adoption agency. They're going to have a lot of questions to answer. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The Webbers had underestimated me, but now the tables had turned. I wasn't just fighting for Lily anymore. I was fighting to expose the people who thought they could take her from me. As I left the police station, I held Lily close, her soft breath warm against my neck. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "They're not going to win." But even as I said the words, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me that the battle wasn't over yet. The Webbers were powerful, connected, and desperate. They wouldn't go down without a fight. The days following the police raid on the Webbers were a blur of tense anticipation and cautious optimism. Detective Harris had promised swift action, but I knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Webbers were resourceful, and their desperation made them dangerous. News of their involvement with the shady adoption agency had spread quickly, drawing media attention to the case. Reporters camped outside the police station, hoping for a comment, while social media exploded with outrage over the idea of wealthy couples exploiting vulnerable single mothers. While it was comforting to see public support, the attention also made me nervous. The Webbers had connections, and I couldn't help but wonder if they'd use their influence to manipulate the narrative. My fears weren't unfounded. 2 days after the raid, an article appeared in a prominent newspaper, painting the Webbers as victims of a misunderstanding. According to the piece, they had been working with the adoption agency in good faith, unaware of its unethical practices. It was a blatant attempt to save face, and it made my blood boil. "They're spinning this to make themselves look innocent," I said to Sarah, throwing the newspaper onto the table. Sarah frowned, skimming the article. "Let them try," she said firmly. "The evidence speaks for itself. They can't wiggle out of this one." But the Webbers weren't just trying to salvage their reputation. They were also fighting back in other, more sinister ways. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered, half expecting it to be another reporter looking for a statement. "Claire," a voice said, cold and familiar. It was Greg. I froze, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" I demanded, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I want you to stop this nonsense," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of menace beneath the surface. "You're making a mistake. You're going to regret this. You're the one who should regret everything you've done." I shot back, my anger overriding my fear. "I'm not afraid of you." Greg chuckled darkly. "Oh, Claire, you should be." The line went dead, but his words lingered, a chilling reminder of the power he still held. I immediately called Detective Harris to report the threat. He assured me that the police were keeping a close eye on the Webbers, but his reassurances did little to ease my mind. Greg's call felt like a warning, a promise that he wasn't done with me yet. The next day, Rachel called with more bad news. "I've been digging into the adoption agency," she said, her tone grim. "It's worse than we thought." According to Rachel, the agency had a long history of exploiting vulnerable parents, using forged documents and legal loopholes to process adoptions without proper consent. In some cases, children had been taken from their families under false pretenses, only to be sold to the highest bidder. "It's a trafficking operation," Rachel said bluntly, "and the Webbers are in deep." My stomach churned at the thought. How many other families had suffered because of this? How many children had been torn away from their parents? "We need to take them down," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "We will," Rachel replied, "but it's going to take time. The police are building a case, but these things don't happen overnight." Time was a luxury I didn't have. The Webbers had already proven that they were willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted. And as the days passed without any significant updates from the police, my anxiety grew. One night, I woke to the sound of Lily crying. I rushed to her crib, my heart racing as I tried to soothe her. As I rocked her back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I returned to my room, I noticed a shadow moving outside the window. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the dark figure lingering near the edge of the yard. I grabbed my phone and called Sarah, who was sleeping upstairs. "There's someone outside," I whispered, my voice shaking. Within minutes, Sarah and Mark were by my side, armed with flashlights and a baseball bat. Mark stepped outside, his voice booming as he shouted at the intruder to leave. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but the incident left us all rattled. The Webbers were escalating, and it was clear they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The next morning, I packed up Lily and drove to the police station. I refused to leave until I spoke with Detective Harris. "You need to do something," I said, my voice trembling with frustration. "They're threatening me, stalking me, and now they're coming to the house. How much more evidence do you need?" Harris sighed, his expression weary. "I understand your frustration, Claire. Believe me, we're doing everything we can. But these cases take time." "I don't have time," I snapped, my desperation boiling over. "What if they take her? What if—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was too horrifying to put into words. Harris placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze steady. "We're going to protect you and Lily," he said. "But I need you to trust us." It was easier said than done, but I didn't have much of a choice. I left the station feeling defeated, but I refused to give up. The Webbers might have money, power, and connections, but they didn't have what I had: the unshakable determination to protect my daughter at all costs. Back at Sarah's house, Rachel proposed a new plan. "We need to make this public," she said. "Expose the Webbers for who they really are. The more people know about what they've done, the harder it will be for them to hide." It was a risky move, but I agreed. Rachel reached out to a journalist she trusted, someone who had experience covering stories about corruption and exploitation. The journalist, a woman named Emily, met with me the next day. She was kind and empathetic, but she didn't sugarcoat the risks. "Going public will put a target on your back," she warned. "Are you ready for that?" "I don't care," I said firmly. "As long as it keeps Lily safe, I'll do whatever it takes." Emily promised to tell my story with integrity, and within days, her article was published. It was a scathing exposé of the Webbers and their connection to the adoption agency, complete with damning evidence from Rachel's investigation. The article went viral, sparking outrage across the country. People flooded social media with calls for justice, demanding that the Webbers and the adoption agency be held accountable. But even as the public turned against them, I knew the Webbers wouldn't go down without a fight. They were desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The Webbers had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. The media storm that followed Emily's article was unlike anything I'd ever seen. News outlets picked up the story, public figures condemned the Webbers' actions, and protests erupted outside the adoption agency's offices. The pressure on the authorities to act swiftly was immense, and for the first time I felt like justice might actually be within reach. But the Webbers were still out there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they had one last move to play. Rachel had warned me to stay vigilant, and I took her advice to heart. Lily and I rarely left the house, and when we did, it was always with Sarah or Mark by my side. The tension came to a head one evening when Detective Harris called with news. "We've arrested Greg Webber," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "We're still working on Allison, but it's only a matter of time." I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. "What did you get him on?" I asked. "Forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a few other charges," Harris explained. "Thanks to Rachel's investigation and the media coverage, we were able to get a warrant for his financial records. Turns out he's been funneling money through the adoption agency for years. It was a major victory, but I knew better than to celebrate too soon." "What about Allison?" I asked. "We've issued a warrant for her arrest," Harris said. "But she's gone off the grid. We're working on tracking her down." The thought of Allison on the loose sent a chill down my spine. She was the mastermind behind everything, and I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, as I rocked Lily to sleep, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The Webbers had already shown how far they were willing to go, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Allison wasn't done yet. I was right. 2 days later, as I was preparing Lily's bottle, the doorbell rang. Sarah was out running errands, and Mark was upstairs, so I answered it without thinking. Standing on the porch was Allison. Her appearance was disheveled, her usual polished demeanor replaced by a frantic, almost feral energy. Her eyes were wild, and her hands trembled as she clutched a large handbag. "Claire," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Can we talk?" I tried to shut the door, but she wedged her foot in the frame. "Don't do this," she hissed, her calm facade cracking. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," I shot back, my voice shaking. "You tried to steal my daughter. You're a monster." Her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won, don't you? But you don't know who you're dealing with. I'll get her, Claire. One way or another, I'll get her." Before I could respond, Mark appeared behind me, his imposing figure blocking the doorway. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, his voice low and threatening. Allison hesitated, her eyes darting between us. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed off, her heels clicking against the pavement. As soon as she was out of sight, I called Detective Harris. Within hours, Allison was located at a motel on the outskirts of town and taken into custody. The relief I felt when I received the news was indescribable. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The Webbers were finally out of my life, and Lily was safe. In the weeks that followed, the case against the Webbers and the adoption agency gained traction. More victims came forward, sharing their stories of manipulation and heartbreak. The agency was shut down, and its owners were arrested, facing charges ranging from fraud to human trafficking. As for the Webbers, Greg and Allison were both sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their once perfect image was shattered, their wealth and connections unable to save them from the consequences of their actions. Through it all, I clung to Lily, my love for her growing stronger with each passing day. She was my light in the darkness, my reason to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, as the sun set and Lily played on a blanket in the yard, Sarah sat beside me, a glass of wine in her hand. "You did it," she said, smiling softly. "You stood up to them and won." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I didn't do it alone," I said. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mark, and Rachel." Sarah squeezed my hand. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. Don't ever forget that." As I watched Lily giggle and clap her hands, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The storm was over, and the future felt bright. They had tried to take everything from me, but they underestimated the power of a mother's love. I had fought for my daughter, for our family, and in the end I had won. And no one, no matter how powerful or ruthless, would ever take her from me again.